Lovely. Thanks very much, Nikki, for the introduction to the session, and welcome to all of you this afternoon. I'll be back to the first slide. So welcome to today's session, which is just a little opportunity. Many of you, I think, are probably going back to school either today or perhaps have already started back a couple of days ago, or maybe even into the beginning of next week. And obviously it's been a really rather busy past couple of months for a variety of different reasons. And I just thought it'd be really useful at the beginning of term just to sort of say, where we are with a variety of things, what's happened, so far, and what will happen. Well, what is meant to happen over the next few months. And I think probably that's the first thing to say at the beginning of the event today, is that obviously I'm giving you a briefing of how the situation is on 3:30 on the 3rd of September 2020, but the way in which developments are happening at the moment, who knows, this could be out of date within a half an hour or half a day or half a week. So we will try and keep you informed as far as we can of what's going on, but do obviously keep an eye on what's happening on the website, because things have been moving quite quickly, and I suspect will continue to move quite quickly over the next few weeks and months as schools go back, and we have isolated incidents of lockdowns and so on. So the other thing just to say as well, you will get a copy of the slides sent to you by email tomorrow. You can download them for yourself today. The only problem is that I noticed at the 11th hour that there is actually one slide which is slightly critical and wrong, because I've managed to get some dates incorrectly in the slide. I will mention it as we go through, because I haven't had a chance to update the slides. But it just means that the presentation you get sent round tomorrow will be a little bit more accurate. Okay, that said, let's press on with what we're going to look at today. So just a little introduction to start off with. I'm going to ask you just a couple of questions just so that I get some idea of who we've got here. We've got quite a large number of teachers logged in for today. And then I'll really sort of go through where we are with the next few months, really. So we'll spend a few minutes thinking about the autumn series that's coming up really quite rapidly now for those students that want the opportunity to sit in the autumn. Then we'll have a little look at the June series, the summer series, what's coming up for the summer and what changes in the A-level specifications. Then we'll have a little bit of time to think about any additional support that we've got in place, just so you know what's available and where it's going to be. And then there'll be time at the end of the session to look at any questions. In fact, questions I can already see are starting to come in. I'm not going to answer any questions at this stage, because quite a lot of them I suspect will get answered as we go through the session, but obviously I will check the box every now and then, and I've left some time at the end to pick up some questions. I suspect we may well finish before 4:15 anyway, depending on how much I talk. So the very first thing I'd just like to know is which specification people are teaching, whether or not you're teaching the Biology A, Biology B, Chemistry or Physics. I have noticed from the introductions from the group chat, people sort of saying who they were and introducing themselves. It does appear we've got a number of people that teach at international schools here. And I know obviously some of you may teach at an international school but deliver the GCE A-level, in which case obviously you can answer this question. If you happen to be at a school where you do the international A-level, then I suppose tick a box which most closely resembles which specification you teach. We're not really going to concentrate very much today on the international A-level, partly because it doesn't have the same sort of changes that are happening to the UK qualifications. The changes that are happening for A-level in the UK for 2021 are specifically to the practical endorsement, which obviously isn't part of the international A-level. So if you're teaching the international A-level, actually nothing really changes, because you'll still continue to have the October series as you always have for the international A-level. You'll continue to have the January series and the June series as you always do for the international A-level. So lovely to have you with you, and do stay if you teach the international A-level, because it's still useful, and I suspect, to listen to things. But obviously the presentation today and the questions are designed for those doing the UK, the GCE A-level specification. Right, I hope as I've been yabbering away, you've had a chance to push one of those buttons. So I'll press on to the next slide and see what we've got. A pretty even split across the specifications. Biology B is our smallest specification. We have relatively small numbers of candidates that sit Biology B, so not surprisingly, we've got fewer Biology B candidates than anything else. But yeah, nice even balance across the sciences. That's absolutely great. And again, just so I get an impression of how experienced everybody is. I'm sure many of you have been teaching for many years. I've been slightly conservative in the options here. So your options are basically NQT. This is your first year in teaching. Relative newbie, and I've called that up to 5 years. And then the hardened professionals of the classroom with 5 or more years. I decided not to embarrass people by going up in 5s until we got to those that had done 30 years plus. So I just thought I'd have NQTs, relatively new people, and as I said, the much more experienced people. So I'll give you another few seconds just to have a look at that. If you don't get time to click on a button, it doesn't matter. It's only for these polls are only for my benefit. It's just that I get some idea of the audience. It's not recorded anywhere, and it's not recorded which button you click. It's just so I get some idea. Okay, so I'm going to have a little look at that one. And oh gosh, my word! So a small number of NQTs. We've got 100 plus people here. So. Perhaps 4 or 5 NQTs, but most of you are seasoned professionals, which is good to know. That means you'll be analysing what I'm saying, I'm sure, and coming back with lots of questions. So just as the last thing of the introduction, what I just wanted to say is just a reminder of where we are, what happened over the summer. So the grades that eventually you got issued in August should, I hope, either have represented the centre assessed grade which you awarded to your candidate, or alternatively, where the algorithm, in the rare occasions where the algorithm worked in your candidate's favour, then obviously the students would get the algorithm grade. So if the algorithm upgraded them, they would get that upgrade rather than the grade that you gave them. But hopefully, you've now got the results that sort of you're expecting, rather than a random selection of U's at the bottom end. And I hope, therefore, that most people are reasonably happy with the way in which that was finally resolved. There are still obviously appeals going on, and the basis for appeals obviously is now a little bit different, because actually most candidates will now have the grade that they were expecting, or you were expecting them to get, because it was the grade you assigned to them. So obviously it's very difficult. In fact, I don't think you can now appeal and say, I've changed my mind. I think that they should have got a different grade. Obviously, if you believe that there was a genuine error in your submission, so in other words, you told your exams officer to put in B and the exams officer put in D, then yes, obviously that would be grounds for appeal. Or if you believe that there's been an error at our end, if you believe that we've mistranscribed a grade from a CAG submission into a final result, then do appeal that as well. And there are details there. There's a little link which gives you an introduction to how to deal with any processes there. But my guess is that in most cases, students are probably really quite satisfied with the grades that they've got as a result. So I'll press on then and think about what's happening this autumn for the series that is coming up really quite rapidly. Just to let you know what's available, there is a link there at the top as well that just gives you somewhere to click to find out more information about the autumn series. But effectively, we are planning a completely full series of exams. So in other words, this will be exactly like the standard May-June summer series. It'll be replicated for the autumn. The one thing to say is that if we don't get any entries at all in a particular subject, then there has been an agreement that we can withdraw. So and that's obviously fairly sensible. There's no point putting a series of exams on if there are no candidates. My guess is that across the 4 science A-levels that we do, there will be entries in every subject, because there were private candidates that were due to sit in May and June that obviously couldn't. because with those candidates, it was not possible to give them a centre assessed grade because, they were homeschooled or, they were private candidates in different ways. So my guess is that we will run the full suite of all 4 A levels, but perhaps not the ASs. So some of the ASs may be withdrawn if there are no entries. Now, the key thing, and one of the reasons I wanted the back to school update to be today, is that the entry deadline is tomorrow. So if it turns out that by tomorrow that we don't have any entries for a particular subject, then we do obviously reserve the right to withdraw that particular subject. Now, unfortunately, this is the slide on which there is the error for the date. So the A-level date is completely correct. That's brilliant. Unfortunately, the table underneath that gives you the deadlines for GCSE, unfortunately, that one's the one that's wrong. So in fact, the 18th of September is the deadline for all GCSE subjects except Maths and English. And Maths and English, the deadline is actually the 4th of October, not the 4th of September. So those are the dates that I will correct in the version of the slides that will go out tomorrow. Okay, so that just gives you an indication of what's there. There is a timetable. The timetable was actually published towards the end of last term. So the dates for the A-levels, they will start on the 5th of October, the AS and A-level exams, and they will run through until the 23rd of October. Now, that's particularly important to note that the end date is the 23rd of October, because I know increasingly now people that work in independent schools often have an extended autumn half-term break. And many of you, that last week of exams may well coincide with the first week of your school half-term. Now, that may well not be an issue because I suspect students that are going to be sitting these exams have probably left school. But of course, they will need somewhere to sit and they will need to be invigilated if they're sitting it in your centres. So it's just so that you're aware there. There's a link there, so you can click on the link and find out what the timetable is. And results will be on the 17th of December. So it's a relatively quick turnaround for this particular series. They sit the exams in autumn. We're not expecting massive numbers of entries, so the marking should be complete over November and results day just before the week before Christmas. The GCSE exams window, for those of you that might have GCSE candidates as well, that effectively starts immediately after half term and runs for 3 weeks. So it runs from the 2nd until the 23rd of November. And the results day then, because obviously marking will happen during December. So results day is the 14th of January for Maths and English, which are the priority subjects because there is always a November series for those 2 subjects for resit candidates. But it does mean that for all the other GCSEs, the results day is actually really quite late. It's the 11th of February. So those are the results day for everything else. So that's all your key dates for the autumn series. And I thought it was also just worth saying who is allowed to enter in the autumn series. It's not designed to be a free-for-all for all students for autumn. So it's specifically for students who were entered in the summer, received a grade, they received a centre assessed grade, and they're not happy with that centre assessed grade. So a student perhaps who hadn't been performing very well in class and in homeworks and in mock exams, you may have given them a D or E for their centre assessed grade, but the student is convinced that on a good day in the exams they could get a B or a C. So that candidate is obviously perfectly entitled to resit. The other one is slightly odder, but it's candidates who had intended to enter in the summer but couldn't because of the arrangement for centre assessed grades. Now, that's actually quite difficult for us to prove, of course, so we'd have to take schools' word for it. But effectively, that will cover private candidates. So the private candidates that had always intended to enter in the summer, and in fact may well have actually made the entry in the summer, but subsequently withdrew the entry because they couldn't be provided with a centre assessed grade. So those candidates are also free to enter. And just to say as well that the fees for the autumn exam will be exactly the same as they were for the summer, for the May-June exam series. The other thing to say about fees is that I can't remember the exact figure, but there was a little announcement a few weeks ago that said how much of the fees that paid in the summer would be refunded to schools. And I can't honestly remember how much it was. I think it's around about 1/3, a little less than a third. But there will obviously be money that comes back because there were no exams. There were obviously other things, other processes that required work and therefore consumed money. But there will obviously be a refund that comes back to all schools because of the cancellation of the exams. So I'm going to ask you a little question. Just interesting to know, are you likely to enter any candidates for the autumn series? So just a quick yes, no. Probably best on this, if you are a centre doing international A-level, probably best that you don't tick this one, because I'll probably get a bit of a biased opinion, because IAL normally has an October series. So this is really just for those that teach the GCE, the UK A-level. Just quickly tick either yes or no, so I get an understanding of if any of you are planning to use the autumn. Okay, give you a couple more seconds. Lovely. Oof. Gosh, right, okay, more than I thought. 28%, that's actually quite a lot that are intending to enter. So it may well be a bigger session as exam series than I thought this autumn. I thought it was going to be tiny numbers, but it may be a bit bigger. So that's interesting to know. There's one other thing just to say that this section of the practical endorsement, this is specifically for the autumn series. Okay, so this applies for candidates that are sitting this autumn still. In most cases, because it's a resit opportunity, students will already have a result for the practical endorsement, and they can just simply carry that result forward and just resit the written exams. Okay? And it's worth knowing that we do count not classified as a result. So if a student has been entered for the practical endorsement and didn't pass, that is still a result, and they can carry that result forwards. Okay, so that's the standard, what we hope will be the standard. If a candidate is sitting for the first time, so these are the candidates that, the private candidates perhaps who weren't able to make an entry first time round, or other students that ended up withdrawing and didn't get a centre assessed grade. So they're entering for the first time. They can still enter as pass or not classified. That's perfectly okay. They can have either grade as always. There might be some circumstances where a student had a not classified grade when the exams ran in the summer, but subsequently they have now got new evidence of practical work and they want to be reclassified as a pass grade. So you entered them in May. At that stage they hadn't done enough practical work, but they've since gone off to a private tutorial college over the summer holidays, and they've managed to get some evidence that they've met the requirements for the practical endorsement, and they now want to be entered as a pass. That's fine. Usually we don't allow that. We usually don't say that you can enter the endorsement as a separate thing by itself, but for this autumn we are allowing candidates simply to resubmit their exams and to be reclassified if necessary for the practical endorsement. And worth saying, just as a final thing here, that if you are submitting a result for the CPAC, even if it's not classified, you do need to submit the standard centre declaration form, just to say that the candidates have been offered the opportunity to do practical, and they've had access to the practical work, even if they're not classified. Okay, so that's the system for the autumn. It's effectively the same as usual, really. That's a sort of standard. That's a sort of pretty much the standard process. Because this is a new route, I'm just curious whether any of you do think you have students that will just simply this autumn ask for the endorsement to be reclassified. So again, just a quick yes, no. Do you think you've got any candidates that are likely to enter just for the endorsement? So a candidate that keeps their centre assessed grade and just asks for the not classified grade for the endorsement to be upgraded to pass. Okay, again, I'll just give you a couple of seconds to answer that. Lovely. Perfect. Now I'll just press that one on. Very few. Yeah, that's sort of what I expected. It would be unusual for candidates to have suddenly done more practical work, but it might exist, which is why the opportunity is there, but very few. That's good. Just because it's come up in group chat, there's a question from Megan about fees, saying, can the fees just be transferred to next year? I don't think that's the way it works. I think rather than keeping a credit, I think we're obliged to issue a refund. And then the money goes back to the school and is reallocated the following year, I think is the way it's meant to work. Other questions I will come on to. I can see the Q&A box is flashing at me, so I will come and have a look at that, promise you, before the end of the session. Just to say, those of you that are doing Biology A, again, for the autumn series, the pre-release article for paper 3 is exactly the same one that was released for the summer. It was in fact only up on the website for about 2 or 3 days before the exam series for the summer was cancelled. But it's the same article for this autumn. The link is there, so if you have got candidates that are entering for paper for Biology A, do obviously give them the pre-release article so that they can prepare for the questions that come up in paper 3. That's the autumn series. I'll now move on and have a look at the June series. So this is what's coming up for next summer. So I'll start off with AS, and this one's quite easy, basically. There are no changes to the specification content, so there's no change to what you actually teach in terms of the spec content and the topics that you teach your students. We're not currently planning any changes to what happens in the exams, so the exams will have the same content, the same style, the same length, the same number of questions. In other words, this is, it's an identical set of AS papers to the sorts of papers we've been setting since 2016. As you know, for AS, there is no requirement for you to assess CPAC for those students, assuming they are only doing the AS and they're not going on to A-level in year 13. But if they're sitting AS as a standalone qualification in year 12, you don't have to assess them for CPAC. But obviously there are practicals within the specification. And part of the specification content of each of the sciences involves students having access to the core practicals. And usually, even if they're an AS student, we'd normally expect them to be doing the practicals, even if you're not assessing them for CPAC. But notice that the modification, which is in red at the bottom, this is the guidance that's come from Ofqual, which now says that the requirement that students have covered the apparatus and techniques by doing the core practicals, the apparatus and techniques which they develop, which are assessed. Students can now meet that requirement by observing demonstrations as well as by carrying out experiments themselves. Okay, so again, notice that what's in italics at the bottom, this only applies to students who are sitting AS in 2021. And I will at the end of today, end of the little session, say something about what happens with year 12, who will be sitting in 2022. So this modification is only for your current year 13. Or of course those that are going into year 12 now and doing a 1-year AS, but any students who are sitting exams in 2021 for AS, this is the permitted modification to the spec for them. They don't have to do the practical work. We'd still recommend, where possible, that they do, because it's the best way of learning the techniques and apparatus, but they can observe demonstrations, videos, or other ways of engaging with the practical. So that's specifically for AS students. So for those that are doing A-level, your students that have just come into year 13, again, important to say there are no changes to the specifications. There's no topics that have been removed. There's no modification to the specification content in any way. And again, there's no changes to the exams. So no change to the content, to the sorts of questions we ask, or to the length of the exam papers. Those exams are the same as they've been, again, since 2017. Worth saying as well, actually, I should have said this at the beginning, obviously these changes that I'm talking to you about that affect the Edexcel specs, exactly the same changes for the other awarding bodies. So, don't think that Edexcel are being mean and, and not having any changes to their specifications or their content. that's common across all awarding bodies, because obviously it's what's been handed down to us by the DFE and by Ofqual. These are the regulations that they've requested and required us to conform to. So the fact that there are no changes to the spec content or no changes to the style of exams is common across all awarding bodies. So the last thing, the thing which does change for A-level, is the practical endorsement. So it will still be awarded to candidates. Your Year 13 candidates are still eligible for the pass grade in the endorsement at the end of the year. But here are the little changes. There are some changes to the evidence needed to award a pass, and we'll talk about that in a moment. There are some changes to the monitoring process for schools that didn't have a monitoring visit last year and we're expecting their monitoring visit this year. And because of those two little changes, the declaration form which you submit in 2021 will also be very slightly modified. So I'll go through all these changes in a little bit more detail for the practical endorsement. And again, notice the bit in red at the top. These changes only apply to your new Year 13 students, so the students that will sit their A-levels in the summer of 2021. So the regulation normally for the practical endorsement is that students have got to be assessed for CPAC on at least 12 practicals, and those practicals must cover the apparatus and techniques which are listed in Appendix 5 of the specification. We obviously have slightly more core practicals than that, which we do for very good reasons indeed. One of the good reasons is happening at the moment is that you have a little bit more flexibility and options of which practicals to do and which ones to avoid. We'd still recommend you did as many as all of them ideally, but that's the minimum number. It's always been 12. So the Ofqual guidance for 2021 now says that a pass can be awarded to students who have completed the minimum number of practical activities required to demonstrate competence. Now, this is one of those wonderful phrases, isn't it? The minimum number of practical activities. The Ofqual guidance doesn't state what that number is. The assumption, therefore, is that it's presumably smaller than 12, but it needs to be big enough that students can demonstrate competence in all of the CPAC statements. Now, we've been through our practicals and we think that probably means not that many fewer than 12. It may be upwards of perhaps 8. But it also depends a little bit on how you alter your practical work for this year. You may well decide that because you're able to do only a smaller number of practicals, you will assess more CPAC statements on each practical, and therefore you may well find that you can get competent. You can get your students to display competence in actually quite a small number of practicals. So depending on the way in which you organise your practical work, you might well find that the minimum number actually could be quite small for this year. Again, I'm quite carefully not putting an actual number on it because, as I said, it will depend very much from school to school. And it will also depend how many practicals those students manage to complete before schools closed in March. When they're 12, some of them may well have already done 5 or 6 practicals. Other students may have only done 1 or 2. So again, the number that you will need to do with your Year 13s this year will depend on how many they've already got under their belt. It will depend on how many CPAC statements you assess on every one. So it will depend a little bit from school to school. The only thing I would say is obviously this does give you a bit more flexibility of practicals that you think, well, actually this one's going to be difficult to do, or alternatively one where you think it's yet another titration practical. They've done plenty of titrations in Year 12. I don't need them to practice this apparatus and techniques. They've done this one. So, okay, I'm just going to omit this one. I'm not going to do the redox titration because they've already done enough titrations. Obviously, if that's the case, perfectly reasonable modification for you to make. Remember, of course, that the exam questions could be based on any core practical activity. So do make sure that the students do still get some access to that practical through video or demonstration or in different ways so that they could still answer questions on that practical. Other key things I think to say, it's not essential to catch up on missed practicals from Year 12. So, if you're sort of thinking to yourself, oh, we only got 3 done out of the 8 in the AS, so I've now got to get all those done plus the other 8. Actually not essential. As long as you can demonstrate CPAC competence over the number that you do, the minimum number that you do in your school, there's not actually a necessity to catch anything else up from year 12. You might, having said that, you might decide that it's quite useful that there's a particular core practical that has a particularly key technique that you just think, oh, there's a question on this every year. We will make sure we catch that one up. But again, if you're not able to do the practicals in year 12 and catch them up, remember that the students can still access them through a video or a demonstration so that, again, they've covered the content and can answer exam questions. What I would say, and again, Ofqual have been quite careful to stress this to us, is that we would encourage you, where it's possible, to still undertake as normal a series of practical work as you can. But obviously at the moment, normal is nowhere near where normal was a year ago. In terms of guidance, and I know a lot of schools are saying we're not quite sure what's possible and what isn't possible. In many cases, of course, it'll be your school that sets the guidance, and your SMT will simply say this is allowed and this isn't. But the other people that are massively useful at this time are CLEAPs, and they've got some very, very good resources on their website, which again give you some indications of what they think is possible and the sort of guidance that will work for safe working in a laboratory where schools have said that they're very happy for that to take place. In particular, even though we've said the minimum number to cover the CPAC statements is absolutely fine, do obviously try and cover as many of the apparatus and techniques as you can with your students. I mean, that after all was the whole point of changing from coursework to this series of endorsement, was that it gave students a wider variety of practical skills and different apparatus and techniques that they got access to. And where possible, it would be lovely to replicate that. But the important, however, again at the end, we would not want to withhold a pass from a student who has shown competency in all of the CPAC statements but hasn't addressed all the apparatus and techniques. So if you've got a student, CPAC 1 to 5, ticks in all the boxes, absolutely competent, they've done that on 6, 7, 8 practicals, but actually they never got round to doing electrochemical cells, and they never got round to doing thin layer chromatography. Fine, still give them a pass. The important thing is that they have the competency in the CPAC, even if they haven't addressed all the apparatus and techniques. But again, important to stress, make sure that if they haven't done the practicals, that they have addressed the apparatus and techniques through demonstrations or through videos, so that they're confident in answering questions on those in an exam. So listen to me chatting for a little bit longer, opportunity for you to click a finger. So thinking back, your current year 13 students, when they were in year 12 last year, normally they would complete either 8 or 9 core practicals, 8 if they were doing biology B, chemistry and physics, 9 if they were doing biology A. So generally 8 to 9. How many of them do you think they actually did? So your current year 13 students, last year in year 12, how many core practicals did they do? And you've got, I've broken it up, I've said none at all. Hopefully there won't be any of those. Only 1 or 2, only a couple. Roughly half, so 3, 4 to 5. Most of them, so 6 to 7, or all of them, 8 to 9. I'm hoping I'm going to see a sort of reasonable bell curve out of this, is what I'm hoping for. I'll give you 30 seconds or so just to click. If you're not sure, just obviously make an estimate of where in the range you think. I mean, the problem, I suppose, is if you think it was either 5 or 6, you've got to make a decision which way or the other. Just another couple of seconds. Perfect. Let's have a little look and see what people have gone for. This is the moment of truth. Okay, that's actually quite encouraging. I know there are a few down at the very, very low end, but actually not very many, which is quite nice. Most of you, the mode answer about half, and that's sort of what I probably expected. It will depend a bit from specification to specification, because in some of the specs, the practical work is more loaded at the front end of the spec, and in others, it's more loaded at the back end of the spec. As a chemist myself, I know that a lot of the practical work in chemistry comes towards the end, because they tend to do a lot of the physical chemistry to start with. But it's also quite encouraging there to see that half of you have done either most or all of them. Now that's great news for you, because you probably already have for your year 13 students you've probably already got those students demonstrating competency in a number of the CPAC statements already. And therefore, I hope that this year you can see that the number of core practicals that you absolutely have to complete is probably going to be no more than half of the A2 ones, which is good news, I hope. So the last thing I need to say about the summer series then is what's happening with monitoring visits. And again, this only applies to the next academic year. So we've got a new monitoring visit process that's in place for 2020-2021. So this academic year that's just started, it's the second year of cycle 3 of the monitoring visits. If your school or centre had a visit last year, then this isn't going to affect you. You've already had your visit for this cycle, and your next visit will be after September 2021. So if you're in that position, excellent. You can switch off for a minute. Otherwise, of course, if you didn't have a visit last year, you will be due one this year. There is one little exception, which is in the tiny footnote at the bottom, is that if you happen to be a very large centre, more than 140 candidates in any one science, or you're a centre that's been naughty in the past and we have worries about the administration of the CPAC in your centre, you might well discover that even if you had a visit last year, you'll get another one this year. But the key thing is that this academic year, rather than a monitor coming out to your school to undertake the visit will now be done remotely. So in other words, let's work you through the process. So that will have three stages. The monitor will get in touch with you and say, hello, it's your monitor here. I want to have a little look at how the practicals work in your centre. And they will ask you to submit the teacher records, which in other words means, I hope in most cases, will just be the tracking spreadsheet. Just email them the tracking spreadsheet. They will then have a look at the tracking spreadsheet and they will come back to you and say, I would like to see this selection of student work. They won't ask for all of it. You'll be pleased to know. They will ask for a selection. So they might say, I want to see these 5 students for core practical 6, and I want to see these 2 students for core practical 9, and I want to see a different set of students for core practical 12. So they'll come back to you with a list of practical that they want to see. And it's then, I'm afraid, the clunky bit about this is that you've then got to find a way to scan the work and send it off to the monitor. My top tip for this is get the students to photograph their own work with their mobile phones and send the image files to you for collation and sending off to the monitor, because then you're not the one sitting doing the photocopying. The monitor will then set up a conversation. It'll probably be the Zoom or Skype, seeing as we're all used to those now rather than being over the telephone. But there'll be some sort of conversation just so that the monitor can have a chat with any of the questions that's come up as they've looked at the student work. So that's the process. It says there at the bottom, further details will shortly be available in the CPAC guidance and tracking section. In fact, that went up the day before yesterday. So if you go to the website, go to the CPAC tracking and guidance section, you'll see that there's a new set of cross-board messaging, which just repeats what I've said about the update to the process. There's a little bit more guidance on what the remote monitoring visit will look like if you're due a monitoring visit this year. And there's also an updated monitoring visit form, because the form is slightly different. Obviously, the one thing that's not happening, as you can see, is there's no observation, because we can't guarantee that a practical will be taking place. I'm sure you don't want extra people coming into schools, so there'll be no observation of a practical lesson. It will all be done on the paperwork for this particular year. So that's that. So just as a rough indication, did your centre have your monitoring visit last year? So how many of you are in the lucky position that this new system won't apply to you? How many of you have already had your monitoring visit for this cycle? So click on a yes if you're a happy and fortunate person rubbing your hands in glee, and click on no if you're thinking, oh my God, I've got to do a whole load of extra stuff for the remote visit. Shouldn't be too much work, I hope so. Give you a couple of seconds just to answer that one. Okay, let's click on and see how it's gone. Yeah, as I'd expected, roughly 50-50. little bit, perhaps a few more that are expecting a visit. It shouldn't be too arduous. I hope it'll be a little bit paperwork heavy for the scanning, but not too bad otherwise. Oh, I've got one last question. There's no chance for you to have a bit of a. I've missed a slide. Sorry, I beg your pardon. I thought I'd missed one. I did say I'd talk a little bit about what happens for 2022. So you're probably thinking that's okay. I know what I'm doing now for my year 13s. What happens with year 12? So the key thing all the way through this, as you've seen with the things in red, is that the changes that Ofqual have introduced only affect your year 13s, effectively those that are sitting in summer 2021. Now, I think that the reason for this is that they're the year group that have been affected by the shutdown, because they were obviously in year 12 at that point. Whereas your new year 12, although they had a disrupted GCSE year, their A-level curriculum hasn't yet been affected. I think we all probably have our opinions of whether or not it will be, but at the moment it is unaffected. And I think the hope, and it's always nice to have hope, is that the year 12 should have as near a normal experience as possible. We will see what that's like. But obviously the situation will be monitored continuously by the awarding bodies and by JCQ, by the DFE and Ofqual, and in the reasonably likely event that there is further disruption this year, then obviously there will be some guidance issued at a later stage which will apply for the 2022 exams and for your current year 12. But where it is possible, obviously try and make sure that your year 12 have as near a normal experience as it's possible to do. Again, it will be practical work that will be the issue. And all I can say is, you can only do what's possible in your centre. And if, as is likely, a large number of schools are not able to complete a number of the practicals this year because of local conditions, the likelihood of there being further changes for 2022, I would have thought, is pretty big. But it's just that we can't confirm yet what they are. So, chance for you to have a little bit of an indication of what you think about what's been agreed for 2021. So, do you think what has been agreed for 2021 is going too far and it should have been completely normal, it's about right, or it doesn't go far enough? While you're doing that, just so I can cover a couple of things that have come up in the group chat. Yes, you will get a link to this recording at a later stage and a copy of the slides. This only covers A-level and not BTEC. I don't think there is an equivalent BTEC session. Practical endorsement doesn't apply. If you teach the UK A-level in an international school, the same regulations for the practical endorsement will apply. But we tend to monitor the international schools in a different way, and we will be in touch about that. Right, let's have a little look and see what people have said. I'm expecting, actually, I have to say that first bar is not entirely unexpected, but it's interesting to see that roughly by 2/3 to 1/3, people say that this is about right. That's sort of, again, roughly what I would have expected. It's probably, actually, I might have expected it to be more 50-50 actually, but there we are. Interesting to know. So lastly, I'm sorry, we are going to overrun by 5 or 10 minutes. I hope that's okay. But ongoing support for the summer, just to say what's happening. So what we've got available, we did produce right at the end of last academic year, we produced some transition tests. So these are, because there weren't GCSE exams, these were effectively mocked up GCSE exams that might be useful either as transition to A-level or to the first year of A-level for your year 12 students. Those are available on the website now, the transition materials. We also released in July a set of mock AS papers, so year 12 mocks, and again they could be useful just as a beginning of term exercise to see where your year 13 students are. Both of those tests, by the way, the year 11 into year 12 transition tests and the year 12 mocks, they're both based on past paper questions, and in both cases I've also got results plus data in with the pack. So as well as the question paper and the mark scheme, you've got a rough indication of the sorts of mark that would be achieved by an A grade student, a B grade student, and so on. So there's a little bit more information on those. We're also working on a bit of a question bank. Obviously, you have Exam Wizard as a question bank, but what we're doing is we're specifically looking at some older past paper questions, arranging those in topics, and we'll release those as well. So you can have specific question banks to go to if you want questions on a particular topic. And of course, the autumn series, when the autumn series is finished, those question papers will go up on the website. They'll be under padlock like a normal exam series, and so you'll be able to use those as mock exams as well. And you've got a little link at the bottom so you know where to find these things on the website. In terms of practical work, obviously you've got all the existing support for practical work that we have in place, the tracker and the practical guides and the worksheets and all of those things that are already available for you free of charge up on the website. Particularly remember that the tracking spreadsheet, and I know a lot of you use that, can be unlocked. You know, we've arranged it so that it grays out particular cells so that you fill in particular ones for particular practical. If you do decide you're going to assess more practical skills on any core practical, you can unlock it. The problem is I can't actually quite remember what the password is. It's Edexcel, but I can't remember whether it's Edexcel all lowercase or Edexcel with a capital E, or possibly even Edexcel all in caps. So try the combinations. It's there at the bottom of the slide, but that's how to edit the CPAC spreadsheet. We're in the process of producing little mapping documents that show you which apparatus and techniques are covered by which core practical. So again, if you're sitting there making decisions about which core practicals you want to do and which ones you might miss out, that might be quite useful because you can look at it and think, oh, core practical 12 is exactly the same skills and apparatus that I've already done elsewhere, so that's a good one for me to miss out. And the other thing we're doing is we're producing a little playlist. So, you know, all the core practicals, or almost all the core practicals, are available somewhere online as a video. But we just thought it would be useful if, rather than having to hunt around for them yourself and Google them, it would be useful if we had a series of links. So we're producing a little playlist for the core practicals. Those last two documents are still in editing at the moment, should be available by the end of this month. Do obviously look at the website as well. There's a new tab on all of our web pages that says specifically 2021 support. That will be updated over the next couple of weeks, and you'll see in there a little list of summaries of what the changes are, some FAQs, and some links to some of the support materials. As I mentioned earlier in the slides, do take a look at the material that's being produced by CLEAPS. Really, really useful set of resources on how to carry out practical work in the current situation. And obviously you've got our contact details as well if you need to get in contact with the science team that way. Lastly, I think, is just to say what's coming up in terms of training for the rest of this term. New to Edexcel events, if you're new to teaching the qualification or you want a bit of a refresher, those events are available to you. They're free of charge. September, October, November, they're a bit spaced out over the term. We're running the network events as we ran in June last term. We're running another set of networks this term. That will concentrate mostly on practical work and on how it's going with the year 13 and the year 12s. Those are all happening just after half term in November. And then a little bit of a the network events are free, and then a little bit of advanced publicity that, because there haven't been exams and feedback and examiner reports and things this year, we're producing a little thing called Understanding Our Exams. So a little event that sort of takes you through the principles behind how we put question papers together, how they're marked, the sort of responses that score well and those that don't, and so on. So those are happening in January. That is it. Any questions? So what I'll do, I will now look at the Q&A and look at the group chat and go through some things. There's a little feedback thing for you to look at the same time here. So I'm just going to run through the group chat first. So, the changes in CPAC don't seem to help the year 13 at all. Yeah, it doesn't help much, but it does mean they can reduce a little bit in the amount that they're able to do. Quite a lot of comments about how difficult it will be to undertake practical work with your with your students, that's fine. Oh yes, one of the things I haven't talked about at all is the exam dates for summer 2021, because as yet we don't know what they will be. There is still that's a decision that's still being made by the government. So we don't know whether the exam series for 2021 will be May and June as normal, or just in June, or June and July. So that is a decision yet to be made. A couple of questions about saying how many times they have to meet each CPAC skill in order to be classed as competent. The regulation says it has to be routine and consistent. Now, routine and consistent in theory means more than once, but actually you could say that it was routine and consistent if they've been working towards it for some time and have now met it. So you could easily justify yourself by saying, they've been having a go at CPAC 3A, they've nearly got it, they've nearly got it, and then they've now got it. And I'd be pretty confident that if I assessed them on it again, they would get it again. So at least once, ideally twice, I think is probably the best guidance. Right, let's go through the Q&A. Oh my word, there are hundreds. Right, okay. So I'm going to go from the bottom upwards and see what they go. So will CPAC practicals be trimmed down? If yes, which ones are still in? So that's entirely up to you. You can make decisions about which ones you think are essential and which ones you might avoid, but remember, of course, that you need to cover all the CPAC statements, even if you don't cover all the techniques and apparatus. There are a lot of these that are just comments. Pre-release material for biology, already talked about that for the autumn. Obviously for the summer series for biology A, that will be released as normal in March. We didn't complete all the AS core practicals. Will there be a decrease in the minimum number? And so yes, whatever the minimum number it is in your school that you can guarantee competency on, that is your minimum number. Do you get a certificate of participation for today's session? I don't think you do, unfortunately, for our online events, sadly, but you will obviously get the email, which you can have as proof that you've attended. Do demos for practicals count for year 13? So yes, they count as the idea that you've covered that part of the specification. Obviously, no, they don't count towards CPAC because you're not actually assessing anything. You could, of course, ask your students to write a plan, which you could then assess for some of the CPAC criteria. Then you could do the demonstration. You could even then give them data, and processing of the data could be assessed for other CPAC skills. Some of the CPAC skills can be assessed through written work rather than by observation. So again, you can be a bit flexible, perhaps. For schools and countries where regulations prohibit practicals or where you're teaching in non-lab rooms due to social distancing, that's a tricky one. I think all we can say for international centres is do what you can. Where you have specific regulations, and I know in Spain in particular, they're very strict, just get in touch with us when you're sort of a term into the course, and let's have a little conversation about what's possible. If school bubbling prevents access to labs, what allowance can be made? Again, that'll be the same thing. We'll have to see what it looks like in 6 months' time. And it may well be that many of you are working in a situation where you can't do any practical work at all this term, and then next term it may be a little bit easier. And again, you have to make decisions about how many practicals you can do to demonstrate CPAC. So how can students satisfy the CPAC skill statements if practicals are done by demo or by video? Similar question we've had that we've already had before. So yes, they could if they're doing a plan before the demo or the video, or they're doing or they do a write-up or an analysis of data, they can still get some access to CPAC, but obviously not to the doing ones. One from Poppy. We have a fairly large number of overseas students who are not returning. How will it work for these students in the practical endorsement if they miss another half or full term of work? Again, it'll just be a case of seeing whether it's possible to get them up to the competency mark when they're finally back to school again. And if they can get there, then excellent, they get the pass. And if they're not able to get there, then unfortunately they would not get the pass. Will there be a reduced practical requirement for the current year 12? So I think we covered that at the end. At the moment, that's an undecided. The regulations at the moment only cover what happens in 2021. Watch this space for 2022. We had a visit for chemistry last year, but not for biology or physics. Will this mean there's no visit for us this year? Yes, that means there's no visit for you. You only get visited in one of the 3 science subjects every 2 years. So if you had a visit any subject last year, you won't get one this year. Megan, you've tried 3 times to get access to the training material for a lead teacher, but no one is replying. The easiest thing to do is, I think the email address you should be going to is A-Level Science Updates, and that's maybe my fault that I haven't responded. So I will take a look at it as soon as we finish today. If you don't get anything back today, get in touch through the subject advisor with the email address that was on one of the earlier slides. Some CPAC statements explicitly require seeing the student carry out a plan. Are they able to meet these through watching a demonstrational video? I would say the answer to that is no. So the ones that explicitly require them to make their own measurements and do their own, to take their own measurements, I don't think they can get that from a demonstration, because in most cases they require some form of manipulation. We're about halfway, or most of the way through the questions. Biology was assessed in the autumn last year. We're expecting chemistry this autumn. Does this mean we had a monitoring different visit as it was in a different subject? So yes, if you had a biology visit last year, autumn last year, you're not due a visit at all this year. Your chemistry visit would be after September 2021. We had a visit last year but needed a follow-up visit to pass. Where does that leave us? So yeah, that's one of the, I should have mentioned that when I went through. So if you had a visit last year but the monitor wasn't happy with some aspect of the visit, then yes, you would have the follow-up through the online procedure. I doubt very much they'd ask you for absolutely everything all over again. They're more likely to say, look, this is the thing that we weren't happy with last time. Can we just see some evidence of that particular aspect? So you'll get a slightly lighter version of the visit. Are there any changes to the CPAC requirements for the current year 12? Not at the moment, but watch this space. I've asked a question about overseas year 13. Oh, that was Poppy. I think I've answered that one. That's good. I don't see how this helps the current year 13 at all. This is, I think that's where I say the Francis Urquhart statement, really. Will monitoring visits expect to see use of the Edexcel spreadsheet for tracking, or will a document just show us that what was passed and when be sufficient? Absolutely up to you. And we tend to like the tracking spreadsheet, because if everyone uses the same thing, it's just a bit easier for the monitor. But if you have your own version of doing it, you've created your own document, as long as it shows all the things that are required. It shows the date of the practical, how many students were there for the session, how many passed, and on which CPAC statements they passed. That's fine. That's fine. That's all it needs to do. So Alina from Bellabiz, we teach mostly international students who will continue or start studying online only this September. So our year 12s and year 13s won't be carrying out practical this term, or perhaps longer. Is there any chance they could still pass the practical endorsement? So I think the advice there would be, do what you can at a distance through things like planning, exercises which you can assess for CPAC 5 and certain aspects of CPAC 2. Do what you can with their ability to process and analyse results, which will cover bits of CPAC 4, and then see what happens. If you're able to get them back into labs at any point so you can assess the other CPAC criteria, then great. But obviously, if they're not able to meet all the criteria, then the off-call rule at the moment is they don't get the endorsement, sadly, at the moment. Another question. I had a monitoring visit in February for physics. We also had a visit last year for AQA biology. That's odd that you had 2 in a year. Will we be getting another this year for Edexcel? I certainly hope not, unless you're a very large centre. So if the reason you've had 2 visits is because you have 140 candidates in one of the sciences, then you might be getting your other visit this year for chemistry, but otherwise, no, you shouldn't expect a visit otherwise. There are many schools operating with year group zones and bubbles. This means there's currently a ban on practical work for both year 12 and 13. Will this be taken into consideration? And again, we can't answer that until we know the extent of how many schools have been affected by that. But I think the fair answer is that it will continue to be monitored by DfE, Ofqual, and by us. And if students haven't been able to do practical work, then it will be up to Ofqual to say whether or not the endorsement can be issued at all, and if it can, who will get it. Claire said, where can I find the tests that you suggested for the new year 13? So if you go to the website, if you go to course materials tab, and then click on teaching and learning materials. I'll see if I can get this to work, actually. I'll show you for Biology A. Oops, so if I go to the website, click on Course Materials, and then if I click on Teaching and Learning Materials, here, and then the assessments should be, it's going to be interesting, the year 11 to year 12 transition tests are here under transition material, and the year 12 into year 13 mocks should be here under mock papers. So they're slightly awkwardly in slightly different places, but that's where they are. The year 12 mocks under mocks, and the year 11 transition material under transition material. So that's where they are on the website. Gosh, I've lost my... There I am. Due to the way my school has bubbles, means that we can't do practicals at the moment. If we get visited in November and haven't done any physical practicals, what will the reaction be to this? So if you're in that situation, if your monitor gets in touch and says, I want to do the visit, and you say we haven't gone back to practical with year 13, they can obviously still see the records that were taken in year 12. If at this stage you haven't done anything from year 12 or year 13, I think all you can do is say to the monitor, we haven't done any practical work. Can you possibly reschedule us in 6 months and see whether or not we've done any practical by then? That's probably the only option you've got, really. Is there only one visit every 2 years, even if the other sciences do other boards? Yes, doesn't matter which awarding body you're with, it's one visit every 2 years in one of the 3 sciences. Right, Megan, thank you. That's the right email address, so it's my fault. I just haven't picked up the email. I will do that immediately we've finished today. Andy's asked why there's no reduction in syllabus content for 2020 to 21. I'm probably not the right person to ask that question to. That was the decision that came from, in fact, in this case, from the DfE. It wasn't even part of the consultation from Ofqual. Ofqual was simply told by the DfE that there would be no reduction in content. So it's a question that perhaps can be addressed to Mr. Williamson or one of his ministers. I think the idea was that because schools have moved to distance learning, most schools had managed to deliver some of the content, no matter how well or badly or how evenly across different students. And that in terms of progression, reducing content means that students will find progression into university degrees more difficult in theory. So I think that was the justification. But obviously there will be a difference of opinion about whether it was the correct decision. And you'll be pleased to know this is the last question, which is, it's very apt. It says, are we getting this session's presentations? Yes, you will. You will get a link tomorrow which contains the slides and also contains a link to the audio as well. Phew, that was the last question. Thank you very much for attending. I'm very sorry we've gone over by about 20 minutes in the end, but there were a large number of questions, not surprisingly. Do please, if you have any further questions, you have the number for the email address for the subject advisor, or do those of you that have a direct route to me, do email me directly. I should say on leave next week, so I probably won't pick up any emails. In fact, I may well end up being on leave for 3 weeks because, in fact, I'm flying to Portugal tomorrow. So I might well have to quarantine for a fortnight when I get back. But I will obviously pick up emails as and when. Thank you so much for coming. Very best of luck for the rest of the term. I hope that you manage to find ways to meet some of these new regulations, and I know they will be difficult. But please be reassured that we will be looking at the situation, and we will be encouraging Ofqual to make further changes if we think they're in the best interests of the students. So enjoy the rest of the evening, and that's me signing off for now. Thanks very much, and goodbye.